All right, hey everybody, just a little short one today here. Let's talk about all these gametes that we've been working with, and we know that there are two kinds of gametes. We've got our sperm cells and we've got our egg cells. We know that these are also haploid gametes, and that these haploid gametes formed through meiosis. Haploid meaning one of each chromosome. So we know that these form through meiosis, and then through random fertilization, we end up with a zygote. And that zygote is n plus n, or 2n. And then through lots of dividing and differentiation, we get a person. And he's waving hello to you. Okay. And he has little worried eyes. Let's see here. We'll give this guy like a nice little nose here. How about some ears? Okay, anyway. Hello, grown-up Charlie Brown. Okay, so let's talk about this egg right here. So we are going to understand how the female reproductive system works to produce these eggs through the use of a bunch of hormones. So we're going to start out by drawing the female reproductive system. So the whole structure of the female reproductive system is designed to produce a mature egg. And when we say mature egg, it's an egg that's ready to be fertilized. We don't mean that it, all of a sudden likes Italian movies and coffee shops and stuff like that. It is also designed to, everything is built together to, misspell a word, to maintain that egg. And by maintain the egg, we're talking about giving it a safe, nutrient-rich place to implant if it does get fertilized. Okay? And finally, the last thing is that these structures are in place to, in the case that the egg doesn't get fertilized, to eliminate the egg. All right. So, just like a lot of our other drawings, you should pay close attention and maybe take notes on how I started and where I go from each place, okay? Anytime I write a function for something, it's a function you have to know. And here we go. Okay, let's start off by drawing kind of a rounded, sort of triangle-ish sort of thing. Okay. Now, we're going to have some tubes coming out of here. They are thin, like not super wide tubes, so don't go crazy on how wide these are. And then this bottom part here is going to form like kind of a double door sort of thing. All right. We're going to take the walls of this structure that we just put together, and we're going to thicken those walls up here. I'm going to shade these in especially in red, because this is a really nutrient blood vessel rich area that we just drew here. And now we're going to label a couple of things. All right. So this red nutrient-rich area that we just drew here is the endometrium. And the endometrium is the lining of the uterus. It is very vascular, which means it has a lot of blood vessels in it. And it is a place for the egg to implant if it gets fertilized, and it sheds at the end of the menstrual cycle if the egg is not fertilized. So, when you think of the end of the cycle being like the quote-unquote period, that all of that stuff that's coming out is this endometrium. Now, this endometrium is the lining of the uterus, and the uterus is this whole thing that we just made right here. And here is where a fertilized egg will implant and develop into an embryo. I didn't label this. This is the uterus. Okay, now, these two tubes here, I wrote my endometrium where I shouldn't have. These two tubes here are going to come around, and we're going to kind of end them in these sort of like finger-like things. They do look like little hands. And then inside of those little hands, we are going to draw them holding this thing right here. So let's label what we've got here. These are the fallopian tubes. It's an O. Fallopian tubes. You might also hear them referred to as the oviducts. These provide a place to transport the egg to the uterus. Also, fertilization happens here a lot. Normally, this is where the egg is fertilized by the sperm. Okay. These are the ovaries. That's one ovary, and there's another ovary on the other side. This is where the eggs mature. Before ovulation happens. Ovulation, we will learn about, is when the mature egg is released and travels down the fallopian tubes. Now we're going to add a little note in here. Here is also where two hormones that are involved in the menstrual cycle are produced. And those two hormones, you've definitely heard of this one, estrogen. The other one is progesterone. Now, we'll learn more about those later, okay? But these are hormones. It's important to understand that. Okay. So now, we've got okay. And now we've got just below the uterus, we're going to have another kind of tube. And in this tube, it needs to not be super wide. It's definitely not as wide as the uterus. You can see it's maybe about half or a third as wide as the uterus. And these things right here are going to serve as kind of like doors leading up into the uterus. And then we're going to also have that same kind of thing down here. Okay? So we're going to label this part right here, these sort of like quote-unquote doors that are leading into the uterus. These are the cervix. There's no need to know the function for the cervix, but however, when if a female does get pregnant, a little mucus plug is formed there, and that mucus plug is really important in making sure that no more sperm come through and keeping infections out and things like that. This tube right here is the vagina. And this is just a place for the penis to get close to the uterus so that the sperm is a little closer to the egg. So it's a passage leading to the uterus. That's where the penis gets closer to the egg. Finally, we have our last part. And this is another, we don't need to know the function of this. And that's these quote-unquote doors here. These are one of the sets of the labia that just keep this closed from the outside environment. Okay, so the menstrual cycle is a process of maturing the egg and maintaining the egg, giving it a healthy environment in which it can be fertilized and develop into an embryo. And then, if there is no fertilization, what word did I use earlier? Aha, yes, eliminating the egg. And this cycle happens by 4 hormones interacting with one another. And remember that hormones are molecules. A hormone is a molecule, and it travels through your bloodstream, and when it hits a certain part, when it hits a certain cell, it triggers a change to happen inside of the cell. Triggers a change inside of the cell. By attaching to a receptor on the outside. So there's 4 hormones that contribute to the menstrual cycle inside of a female. The first 2 you've heard of because we already wrote them: estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen thickens the endometrium, triggers your cells to build up more blood vessel connections and produce more cells and make more mucus and things like that. progesterone also does this. It also thickens the endometrium. But this one keeps it there, whereas estrogen stimulates the start of the thickening. Now, all hormones are produced in a place and then secreted around the body. And these hormones are produced in the ovaries. Our next two hormones are known as luteinizing hormone. We are always going to abbreviate that, just LH. And follicle stimulating hormone. Now, before you hear that word follicle and think hair, it has nothing to do with hair. Now, interestingly, these two right here are produced not down in the ovaries or in the uterus or in the vagina or the cervix or the fallopian tubes or nowhere like that. Interestingly, these are produced in the anterior pituitary gland, which is in the brain. All right, so what do these two things do? Let's start with the follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone. It stimulates follicle growth in the ovaries. Now, this follicle is where the egg matures. So this is what starts the whole process going. So when the follicle grows, the egg can mature. Luteinizing hormone, it's produced in a surge, which means it's not produced throughout the whole cycle, but instead it's produced about in really high concentrations at about day 14 of the menstrual cycle. And it causes ovulation. Now, these hormones work together in a very, very, very specific way that we are going to pick back up on in a couple of days. But hormones work in these really interesting sets of cycles where the presence of one will inhibit the other. And when that one goes away, then the other one is allowed to continue its job. So today was all about getting some background on the female reproductive system. Tomorrow, we'll do a lot more detail about hormones. And then the day after that, we'll come back around and see how these hormones, based on what we learned about the day prior, balance each other out and make this cycle a continuous thing. That's it for today. Take it easy.